She crossed a continent, chasing a promise whispered in a letter. A new life, a new husband, a new home under the vast Arizona sky. But the man waiting for her wasn't at the train station. He wasn't in the dusty saloon or the general store. The only place she found him was in a freshly dug grave. Alone, penniless, and 1,000 miles from anyone she knew, her only hope comes from the one man the town despises, a half-Apache rancher with secrets as deep and dangerous as the land itself. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of what happens when a dead man's secrets refuse to stay buried. The train shrieked a metallic cry against the vast, indifferent silence of the Arizona territory. For 3 days, that sound had been the rhythm of Josephine's new life, a relentless chugging that propelled her further from the damp, crowded streets of Boston and deeper into a world of raw, sun-scorched earth and limitless sky. She pressed her face against the grimy window, the glass hot to the touch, and watched the blur of ochre sage and distant hazy mountains. It was a brutal, beautiful landscape, as stark and unforgiving as the Bible Psalms her father used to read on Sunday mornings. Her destination was a pinprick on the map called Redemption, a name that seemed to her a promise in itself. In her hand, she clutched the letter that had summoned her here, the paper softened and creased from countless readings. The handwriting was a man's, strong, clear, and full of assurances. Thomas Jones. His name felt solid, dependable. He had written of his successful ranch, of the need for a wife to make his house a home, of his desire for a partner to share in the prosperity he was carving from the wilderness. He had enclosed a photograph, a stern-faced man with kind eyes and a thick, well-kept mustache, standing proudly before a modest but sturdy-looking cabin. To Josephine, trapped in a life of thankless servitude as a governess to a wealthy, callous family, Thomas Jones's proposal was more than an offer of marriage. It was an offer of salvation. At 26, she was firmly on the shelf, her prospects as barren as the winter trees in a Boston cemetery. This was her one desperate gamble for a life of her own. As the train slowed, groaning and hissing steam, the town of Redemption materialized from the heat haze. It was smaller, dustier, and more desolate than she had allowed herself to imagine. A single wide street, rutted by wagon wheels, was flanked by a dozen or so weathered, false-fronted buildings. A saloon with swinging doors. A general store, a blacksmith's forge, belching black smoke, and a sheriff's office with a faded hand-painted sign. There was no station to speak of, just a raised wooden platform. Heart hammering against her ribs, Josephine gathered her single battered valise and stepped down from the carriage. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall of shimmering air that stole her breath. The dust, fine as flour, immediately settled on her dark traveling dress, turning the hem a dull, chalky brown. She stood on the platform, a solitary figure in a sea of indifferent space, and scanned the few faces that had turned to watch the train's arrival. A couple of weathered cowboys, a woman in a calico dress herding 2 small children, an old man spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. None of them was the man from the photograph. A pang of disappointment, sharp and cold, pierced her hopeful anticipation. Perhaps he was delayed. Ranching was demanding work, she knew. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and made her way toward the general store, the largest and most central building in town. The interior of the store was a cool, dim cavern, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and smoked meats. A portly man with a magnificent handlebar mustache and a stained white apron stood behind the counter, polishing a set of scales. "Excuse me, Josephine," said her voice, sounding small and reedy. The man looked up. his eyes appraising her from head to toe. "Help you, ma'am. I'm looking for Mr. Thomas Jones." I was, expected. She felt a blush creep up her neck. To announce herself as a mail-order bride felt shamefully forward. The storekeeper's genial expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He set the scales down with a soft clink. "Jones, you say?" "Yes. He owns a ranch nearby. He was to meet me at the train." The man exchanged a quick, unreadable glance with a woman sorting bolts of fabric in the corner. "Ain't you heard?" he asked, his voice now carefully neutral. "Heard what?" A knot of dread began to form in Josephine's stomach. "Has there been an accident?" You could say that the man said slowly, choosing his words with deliberate care. He wiped his hands on his apron, a gesture that seemed designed to stall for time. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. There's no easy way to say it. Tom Jones is dead." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the heat outside. Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Dead," she whispered, the sound barely audible. "But how?" "His letter. It only arrived a few weeks ago. Things happen fast out here," the storekeeper said, his gaze dropping to the countertop. "He was found a couple of days ago. Horse through him, looks like. Neck broken." The woman in the corner finally spoke, her voice laced with a strange mixture of pity and resentment. "Sheriff Thorne handled it. Buried him up on Cemetery Hill yesterday." Buried. Yesterday. The finality of the word was like a physical blow. The entire foundation of her new life, the future she had so carefully constructed in her mind, had just crumbled into dust. The kind eyes in the photograph were closed forever. The strong hands that had written the letter were still and cold beneath the earth. But his ranch, she managed to stammer her mind, grasping for any piece of driftwood in the sudden overwhelming shipwreck of her hopes. His property, I was to be his wife. The storekeeper sighed a weary, heavy sound. "That's a matter for the law, I suppose. Sheriff Thorne would be the one to talk to." But Tom, he wasn't a man with many friends, kept to himself, and he had debts. The unspoken implication was clear. There was nothing for her here. No ranch, no home, no husband. Just the crushing weight of a broken promise and the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Arizona desert. The pity in the woman's eyes had hardened into something that looked unnervingly like suspicion. Josephine was no longer a bride-to-be. She was a problem, an outsider, a complication in a town that clearly preferred its affairs simple and its secrets buried. She mumbled a thank you, her voice hollow, and stumbled back out into the blinding sunlight. The town, which had seemed merely desolate before, now felt actively hostile. Every closed door, every shadowed alleyway, seemed to hold a silent judgment. She was a fool, a naive Boston fool who had traded a life of quiet misery for one of public humiliation and absolute destitution. Her gaze drifted to the low hill overlooking the town, dotted with a few crooked wooden crosses. Cemetery Hill. Her fiancé was up there, the only person in this entire God-forsaken territory she had any connection to, and he was already in his grave. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She leaned against a rough wooden post, her valise slipping from her numb fingers to land with a soft thud in the dust. The journey was over. She had arrived, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The climb to Cemetery Hill was a pilgrimage of grief and disbelief. Each step felt heavy, as if her boots were filled with the very dust that now claimed Thomas Jones. The sun beat down on her back, her dark dress absorbing the heat until it felt like a shroud. By the time she reached the crest of the hill, her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and sweat trickled down her temples, carving clean paths through the grime of her journey. It was easy to find his grave. It was the freshest, a raw, angry mound of reddish earth that stood out amongst the weathered, grass-starved plots. A simple wooden cross had been hammered into the head of the mound, with a name crudely burned into the wood: T. Jones. Josephine sank to her knees beside it, the rough dirt scraping against her skirt. There were no tears. The shock was too profound, a cold, hard stone lodged in her chest where her heart should be. She traced the letters of his name with a trembling finger. This was it, the sum of all her hopes, all her dreams, reduced to a pile of dirt and a splintered piece of wood. The silence here was different from the silence of the prairie. It was a heavy, listening silence, filled with the weight of endings. She didn't know how long she knelt there, lost in a stupor of despair. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The heat finally began to break, replaced by a creeping desert chill. It was the sound of a horse's soft nicker that finally broke the spell. Josephine's head snapped up. Standing not 50 feet away, partially silhouetted against the dying sun, was a man on horseback. He was as still as the landscape around him, watching her. He hadn't approached. He had simply appeared as if he had risen from the earth itself. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was alone, a woman on a desolate hill with a strange man. He was tall and lean in the saddle, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life of hard, physical labor. He wore practical, dusty rancher's clothes, but it was his face that held her attention. Even from a distance, she could see the sharp, high cheekbones and the straight black hair that fell to his collar. He was dark-skinned, his complexion weathered by the sun to the color of rich leather. He was, she realized, with a jolt of mixed blood. An Indian, or part Indian at least. In Boston, she had only ever seen them in illustrations depicted as savage and wild. This man was neither. He was watchful, composed, and possessed an aura of quiet power that was both unsettling and intriguing. He slowly dismounted his movements, fluid and economical. He didn't approach her directly, but walked over to another grave a few plots away from Jones's. He crouched down, brushing some dust from a weathered marker. He was giving her space, she realized, not crowding her. It was a small, considerate gesture that eased the tightness in her chest. After a moment, he straightened up and turned to face her. His eyes, dark and piercing, met hers across the short distance. "You must be the woman he was waiting for," he said. His voice was low and steady, with a calm authority that seemed at odds with the town's nervous energy. Josephine got to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress. "You knew him, Mr. Jones?" "He was my neighbor," the man replied. "Our lands bordered each other. My name is William Foreman. Most folks call me Will." He walked towards her. Then his steps unhurried. As he drew closer, she could see the details of his face, a strong jaw, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled, and eyes that held a deep, unreadable sorrow. He looked not at her, but at the fresh grave. "I'm sorry for your loss. Tom was a good man, quiet, but a hard worker. They said his horse threw him." Josephine said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. Will's gaze flickered a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. He was silent for a long moment, studying the disturbed earth. "That's what the sheriff says." The way he said it planted a seed of doubt in Josephine's mind. There was a reservation in his tone, a hint that he did not entirely accept the official story. Before she could question him further, the sound of another horse approaching drew their attention. Riding up the hill was a large, imposing man, with a florid face and a silver star pinned to his vest. He had a thick neck and small, suspicious eyes that immediately locked onto Will Foreman. This, Josephine knew instinctively, was Sheriff Elias Thorne. Foreman Thorne grunted, his voice thick with authority. He brought his horse to a halt, deliberately positioning it between Will and Josephine. "What business do you have up here paying my respects?" Sheriff Will said, his voice remaining level, though Josephine could feel the tension that suddenly crackled in the air between the two men. "Same as you, I imagine." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "I'm here because we have a visitor." He nodded curtly at Josephine, but his gaze returned to Will, cold and hard. "This is a private matter. I'll handle it." The sheriff's hostility was palpable. He looked at Will not as a fellow citizen, but as a threat. It was the same veiled prejudice Josephine had seen in the eyes of the wealthy Boston families when they spoke of the Irish immigrants who lived in the tenements. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, turning his attention to Josephine, his tone falsely solicitous. "I'm Sheriff Thorne. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. It's a tragic business. Now we need to sort out your situation. I assume you have no funds?" Josephine flushed with humiliation. "I have a little. It won't last long," Thorne said dismissively. "There's a stagecoach heading east in 2 days. The town can take up a collection. Get you a ticket back to wherever you came from. It's for the best." He was not offering help. He was issuing an eviction notice. A wave of panic seized her. Go back. To what? A life of drudgery and condescension. To admit to everyone that her one great hope had ended in disaster. The thought was unbearable. It was Will who spoke into the suffocating silence. "She can stay with me." The words dropped into the twilight like stones into a still pond. Sheriff Thorne's head whipped around, his face contorting in disbelief and fury. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Sheriff Will said calmly, though his eyes were now hard as flint. "My ranch is just over that ridge. I have a spare room. The lady needs a place to stay while she figures out her affairs. It's the neighborly thing to do." He looked directly at Josephine, his dark eyes holding hers. It was not a proposition, but an offer of sanctuary, an offer of protection. Tom was my friend. I'd be honored to offer his intended the hospitality of my home. The mention of his friendship with Jones seemed to infuriate the sheriff even more. "You keep your nose out of this, Foreman. This is white folks' business." The ugly prejudice was now laid bare. But Will didn't flinch. He stood his ground, a quiet, immovable object against the sheriff's blustering rage. He was offering her a choice, Josephine realized, a choice between crawling away in defeat or staying to face whatever came next. He was offering her a sliver of hope in a world that had suddenly gone dark. "Thank you, Mr. Foreman," Josephine said, her voice stronger than she thought possible. "I accept your offer." Sheriff Thorne's face turned a shade of purple. He looked from Josephine's determined expression to Will's implacable calm, and for a moment he seemed to swell with impotent fury. "You'll regret this," he spat the words directed at them both. "Both of you." He wrenched his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it snorted in protest, and galloped back down the hill towards the town, leaving a cloud of dust and resentment in his wake. In the ensuing silence, Josephine looked at the half-Apache rancher, who had just declared himself her protector. She knew nothing about him except that he was the one person who hadn't tried to send her away. He was a man who stood against the sheriff, a man who called the deceased his friend, and a man who looked at a fresh grave and didn't believe the official story. For the first time since she'd stepped off the train, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a dangerous, uncertain feeling, but it was better than nothing. It was the feeling of a story that had not yet ended. The ride to Will Foreman's ranch was a journey into a different world. As they left the town of Redemption and Cemetery Hill, behind the landscape seemed to soften and breathe. The oppressive weight of the town's suspicion lifted, replaced by the vast, clean silence of the open range. They rode in silence for the first mile. Will leading the way on his sturdy buckskin, Josephine following on the horse Thomas Jones had apparently left at the livery stable, a gentle mare that seemed to know the path. Will's ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected on one side by a high rocky mesa that glowed red in the last rays of the setting sun. It was not the sprawling empire of a cattle baron, but it was substantial and well kept. A long, low cabin built of dark, sturdy logs sat at the heart of the property, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. A large, well-constructed barn stood nearby, along with a series of corrals where a dozen or so horses grazed peacefully. The entire place radiated an air of competence and quiet pride. It was, Josephine thought with a pang of sorrow, exactly the kind of place Thomas Jones had described in his letters. "The cabin has 2 rooms," Will said, as they dismounted, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "My room and a spare. The spare is yours. There's a lock on the inside of the door." It was a simple statement, but it carried a world of meaning. He was acknowledging her vulnerability and his own position as an outsider. He was offering her not just shelter, but safety and respect, a courtesy the so-called civilized men in town had failed to extend. He showed her to the room. It was small and sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed covered by a colorful woven blanket, a small wooden table, and a single chair. But it was impeccably clean, the floor swept, and the air smelling faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. Through the single window she could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, impossibly bright and close in the clear desert air. Over the next few days, a quiet, unspoken routine developed between them. Will was an early riser, gone from the cabin before dawn to tend to his horses and the small herd of cattle that grazed in the valley. He was a man of few words, his movements deliberate and efficient. He worked with a quiet intensity, whether he was mending a fence, shoeing a horse, or breaking a wild mustang in the round pen. Josephine watched him from the cabin porch, fascinated by his skill and his deep intuitive connection to the animals and the land. He was as much a part of this wild country as the hawks that circled overhead. Josephine, in turn, made the cabin her domain. She cooked, cleaned, and mended, grateful for the sense of purpose the simple domestic tasks provided. She found a small vegetable garden behind the cabin and spent hours weeding and tending to the plants. It was a peaceful, almost idyllic existence, a strange interlude of Groom in the midst of the storm that had wrecked her life. But beneath the surface of this quiet domesticity, the mystery of Thomas Jones's death lingered like a ghost. Will never spoke of it directly, but Josephine would often catch him staring off towards the ridge that separated his land from Jones's, his face a mask of grim contemplation. She knew he didn't believe it was an accident, and the knowledge sat between them, a silent, unanswered question. Her opportunity to search for answers came on the third day. Will announced that he needed to ride to the far end of the valley to check on a section of fence, a task that would take him the better part of the day. Left alone in the quiet cabin, Josephine knew what she had to do. Among the few belongings the sheriff had grudgingly released to her was a small leather-bound trunk containing Thomas Jones's personal effects. She had not yet been able to bring herself to open it. Now, with a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside were the mundane possessions of a man's life, a few worn shirts, a razor, and Strop, a dog-eared copy of Shakespeare's plays. But at the very bottom, tucked beneath a false floor, she almost missed, was a small, locked metal box. Using the tip of a fireplace poker, she managed to pry the weak lock open. The box contained a stack of papers. Most were receipts and deeds, but one document was different. It was a letter written in Jones's familiar, steady hand, but it was a draft full of crossed-out words and revisions. It was not addressed to her, but to a man named Mr. Abernathy at the Territorial Marshal's office in Prescott. Her hands trembling, Josephine began to read. To Mr. Abernathy it began. I write to you in a matter of the gravest importance. I have come into possession of evidence proving that the cattle baron Harrison Croft has been engaged in a massive rustling operation. He is not just stealing unbranded mavericks, he is actively stealing branded cattle from smaller ranchers across this territory, altering their brands and driving them to the railhead at Tucson to sell as his own. His operation is vast and protected. Even our local sheriff Elias Thorne is on his payroll, ensuring that any complaints are lost and any investigations are directed away from Croft's ranches. Josephine's blood ran cold. Sheriff Thorne in the pocket of a criminal. It explained the man's instant hostility, his eagerness to get rid of her. She continued reading, her heart pounding. Croft is a dangerous and ruthless man. He has a reputation for violence, and those who cross him have a habit of disappearing or meeting with unfortunate accidents. I have in my possession a ledger stolen from Croft's own bookkeeper, detailing the stolen herds and the payments made to Thorne and others. It is my proof. I fear for my life, but I cannot stand by and watch this man destroy my neighbors. I intend to bring the ledger to you in Prescott myself. I will leave in 3 days' time. The letter was dated the day before he was found dead. He wasn't thrown from his horse. He was murdered. Murdered because he was about to expose a powerful man and his corrupt sheriff. The accident was a lie, a cover-up for a cold-blooded killing. Suddenly, Will's quiet suspicion, the town's nervous silence, and Thorne's aggressive behavior all clicked into place. This wasn't just about a broken promise or a tragic accident. She had stumbled into the middle of a war. A floorboard creaked on the porch. Josephine jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She quickly shoved the letter back into the box and slid it under the bed just as Will Foreman stepped through the door. He had returned early. He stopped short when he saw her face, his dark eyes instantly reading her alarm. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" Josephine looked at the man who had offered her shelter. He had called Thomas his friend. He lived under the shadow of the same powerful men who had murdered his neighbor. He was the only person she could trust. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she met his gaze. I think she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know who killed Thomas Jones." Will listened without interruption, his face impassive as Josephine recounted the contents of the letter. She pulled the metal box from under the bed. her hands still shaking as she handed him the damning document. He took it, his long fingers brushing against hers, and read it by the fading light of the window. The silence in the small cabin, stretched taut and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. When he finally looked up, the sorrow in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard anger. It was a dangerous look, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. "Harrison Croft," he said the name a low growl. "I knew it. I knew Tom wasn't the kind of rider to be thrown by a spooked horse." "The letter mentions a ledger," Josephine said, her voice urgent. "Proof. He said he had it. It must be here somewhere on his property. If it is, we need to find it before Croft does." Will said, his mind already working, calculating. "If he even suspects you know about this, that you have this letter." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew the danger she was in. The danger they were both in. A cold fear more potent than anything she had felt before washed over Josephine. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival. "What do we do? For now we do nothing," Will said, his voice firm. "We act as if nothing has changed. You are a grieving woman, and I am a rancher who took you in out of pity. We give them no reason to suspect we know anything. But we watch, and we wait for our chance to search Tom's cabin." The waiting was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound was a potential enemy. The quiet peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by a constant humming tension. Josephine found herself watching the ridgeline, half expecting to see riders appear. She didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, they came. 4 of them. They rode into the valley, not with the haste of an attack, but with the slow, arrogant swagger of men who owned the world and everything in it. At their head was a man who could only be Harrison Croft. He was a stark contrast to the rough men who rode with him. He was dressed in a tailored black suit and a fine silk vest, looking more like a banker from back east than a cattleman. He was handsome, in a predatory way, with silvering hair at his temples, a perfectly trimmed moustache, and eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. He exuded an aura of immense power and casual cruelty. Beside him, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was Sheriff Thorne. Will met them in the yard, positioning himself between them and the cabin door, where Josephine stood, watching her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Foreman!" Croft said, his voice smooth as polished stone, though it carried an undercurrent of menace. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was sorry to hear about Tom Jones. A terrible tragedy." "It was," Will replied, his voice flat and non-committal. Croft's gaze slid past Will to Josephine, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. It was a look of appraisal, like a man judging livestock. "And this must be the unfortunate bride-to-be. This is Miss Parker," Will said, stepping slightly to block Croft's view. "She's under my protection." The words hung in the air, a clear and deliberate challenge. Croft's smile weakened, becoming something sharper, more wolf-like. "Protection. An admirable quality in a neighbor, but I'm afraid there's the small matter of Jones's outstanding debts. He borrowed a substantial sum from me a few months back. For improvements on his ranch, he said." It was a lie Josephine knew. A pretext. "A debt is a debt," Croft continued, his voice hardening. "His property, his cattle, they were collateral. Now that he's gone, I've come to collect what is owed to me. Sheriff Thorne has the paperwork all in order. He was going to seize Jones's ranch legally and officially with the bought and paid-for sheriff as his witness. and in doing so, he would be free to search every inch of the property for the missing ledger. That's a matter between you and the law. Will said, his body tense, his hand resting casually near the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. It has nothing to do with me or Miss Parker. Doesn't it, Croft's eyes glinted with malice. I think it does. You see, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to forgive a portion of the debt, in exchange for a little cooperation. Perhaps Jones mentioned his business dealings to his new bride, or to his friend. The threat was clear, wrapped in a silken veil of civility. Tell me what you know, or I will destroy you. Josephine felt a tremor of fear, but when she looked at Will, she saw no fear in his eyes, only a cold, unyielding defiance. He was like the rock of the mesa behind them, immovable and unbreakable. Tom never discussed his finances with me. Will said, his voice dangerously quiet. And I'd advise you to keep your distance from Miss Parker. She's been through enough. For a long moment, the two men locked gazes, a silent battle of wills fought in the dusty ranch yard. The air was thick with unspoken violence. Croft's men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving towards their own guns. Finally, Croft broke the silence with a soft, humorless laugh. Very well. Have it your way, Foreman. But know this, I always get what I'm owed, one way or another. He gave a curt nod to the sheriff. Thorne, you'll see to the legalities at the Jones place. Sheriff Thorne, who had been sweating profusely throughout the exchange, just nodded numbly. Croft turned his horse, his cold gaze sweeping over Will and Josephine one last time. It was a look that promised retribution. Then he and his men wheeled their horses around and rode out of the valley, leaving behind a silence that felt more dangerous than the confrontation itself. As the dust settled, Josephine finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the doorframe for support. Will turned to her, his face grim. He knows, he said. He doesn't have proof, but he suspects we know something. That's why he came here, to test us. The ledger, Josephine whispered. He's going to search the ranch for it. Then we have to get there first, Will said, his jaw set in a hard line. A new, desperate urgency propelled them. The game had changed. It was no longer a matter of waiting for an opportunity. It was now a race against a man who would not hesitate to kill to protect his secrets. A race for the truth and a race for their lives. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of velvet darkness that swallowed the landscape. It was the perfect cover. Will and Josephine moved through the sagebrush like ghosts. The only sounds the soft tread of their boots on the sandy soil and the frantic beating of their own hearts. They had left their horses tethered in a ravine a mile away, approaching Thomas Jones's ranch on foot from the south, avoiding the main path they knew would be watched by Croft's men. Jones's cabin stood dark and silent, a lonely silhouette against the star-dusted sky. A single light burned in the bunkhouse nearby, where Croft had stationed 2 of his men to secure the property. Will held up a hand, and they froze, crouching behind a cluster of mesquite. They could hear the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of a bottle. They'll be drinking, Will whispered, his breath warm against Josephine's ear. It will make them careless, but we still have to be quiet. He led her not to the front door, but around to the back of the cabin, to a small, low window. With the tip of his knife, he worked at the latch with a surgeon's patience and precision. After a few tense moments, it gave way with a soft click. The window slid open, barely making a sound. I'll go first, he whispered. Stay here until I tell you it's safe. He swung himself through the opening with a silent, fluid grace that made Josephine think of a panther. A moment later, his voice came from the darkness within. "All clear." Heart in her throat, Josephine scrambled through the window, Will's strong hands helping her down. The air inside the cabin was stale and heavy with the scent of a life cut short. Cold ashes, old tobacco, and a faint, lingering smell of the pine soap Thomas used. It was a home without a heart, and a fresh wave of grief for the man she never knew washed over her. "We have to be fast," Will breathed, his voice pulling her back to their desperate purpose. Where would a man like Tom hide something important? They had no lamp, only the faint starlight filtering through the windows. They moved through the single room in a frantic, silent search. They checked the obvious places first, under the mattress in the cold hearth, inside the small cupboard. Nothing. Josephine ran her hands along the rough wooden walls, searching for any loose boards. Her fingers brushed against the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The stones were large and uneven, set with thick mortar. As her hand passed over one particular stone near the floor, she felt it shift just slightly. "Will," she hissed, her voice trembling with excitement. He was at her side in an instant. Together they worked at the stone, their fingers finding purchase in the cracks. It was heavy, but it came loose, revealing a dark, hollowed-out space behind it. Reaching inside, Will's fingers closed around a heavy oilcloth-wrapped parcel. He pulled it out and unwrapped it on the floor. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger. They had found it, the proof. A triumphant, giddy relief surged through Josephine. They had done it. They had beaten Croft. But their victory was short-lived. A sudden shout from outside shattered the silence. "Hey, what was that noise?" "The guards. They must have heard the stone. Time to go." Will said, his voice urgent. He shoved the ledger into his saddlebag and grabbed Josephine's hand. "Not the window. The front door. It's closer to the rocks." They burst out of the cabin door just as the two guards came around the side of the bunkhouse, lanterns held high. For a heart-stopping second, they were all frozen in a tableau of surprise. "It's Foreman!" one of the men yelled, fumbling for his gun. Will didn't hesitate. He fired his Colt not at the men, but at their lanterns. The first lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. The second shot sent the other lantern crashing to the ground, plunging the yard into near-total darkness. "Run!" Will yelled, pulling Josephine along with him. They scrambled toward a jumble of large boulders at the edge of the clearing. A gunshot rang out behind them, the bullet whining past Josephine's head with a terrifying hiss. She stumbled, a cry of fear escaping her lips, but Will's grip on her hand was like iron, pulling her forward, keeping her on her feet. They dove behind the rocks just as another bullet ricocheted off the stone with a sharp crack, sending splinters of granite flying. They were pinned down. "We can't stay here," Will panted, reloading his revolver with swift, practiced movements. "They'll circle around us." He peered over the top of the rock. The guards were advancing cautiously, using the bunkhouse and a water trough for cover. In the distance they could hear shouting. More of Croft's men were coming. The situation was desperate, hopeless. They were outmanned and outgunned. But as Josephine looked at Will's face in the faint starlight, she saw not despair, but a fierce, focused determination. His Apache blood, the heritage that made him an outcast in the white man's world, was now their only advantage. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a warrior fighting for his life on his own ground. "There's a dry wash about 100 yards that way," he said, pointing into the darkness. "It leads back towards the ravine, where we left the horses. If we can make it there, we can lose them. They're between us and the wash, Josephine said, her voice shaking. I know, Will said. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, you run. Don't look back. Just run for the wash. Do you understand? No, she said, her voice fierce. I won't leave you. A rare, fleeting smile touched his lips. You're a brave woman, Josephine Parker. But you're not a good shot. Now do as I say. Before she could argue, he took a deep breath and then burst from behind the rock, firing his revolver as he ran not towards the wash, but in the opposite direction, drawing the guards' attention and their fire. Now, Josephine, go! He yelled over his shoulder. For a second, she was paralyzed by fear. But his sacrifice, his raw courage, ignited something in her. She turned and ran her legs, pumping her lungs, burning. She ran for the darkness, for the safety of the dry wash, for the chance at a future that Will was trying to buy for her, with his own life. The sound of gunshots echoed behind her, a terrifying, brutal symphony in the heart of the silent, unforgiving desert. Josephine ran with a desperation she had never known, her mind a chaotic storm of terror and adrenaline. She did not dare look back. To look back was to see Will fall, and that was a sight she knew she could not bear. She fixed her eyes on the darker line of shadow that marked the edge of the dry wash, pushing her body harder than she thought possible. The thorny branches of greasewood tore at her skirt and scratched her arms, but she barely felt it. The only thing that mattered was reaching the wash. She half fell, half slid down the sandy embankment, landing in a heap at the bottom. For a moment she lay there, gasping for air, her ears ringing with the sound of her own blood and the now distant pop of gunshots. She had made it. But what about Will? The gunshots had stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Had they killed him? Was she now truly alone, a fugitive with a dead man's ledger and a death sentence on her head? A pebble skittered down the bank beside her. Josephine scrambled backwards, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. A figure slid down the embankment, landing silently beside her. It was Will. He was alive. He was breathing heavily, and there was a dark, bloody gash on his forehead where a bullet had grazed him. But he was alive. Relief so profound, it was painful washed through her, leaving her weak and trembling. He pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes scanning the rim of the wash. They'll come looking, he whispered, his voice raspy. But they'll be on horseback. The wash will hide our tracks. He led her through the winding, sandy channel, his knowledge of the terrain their only guide in the disorienting darkness. He moved with a purpose and certainty that was awe-inspiring. He was not just surviving. He was using the land as a weapon, turning the wilderness that his enemies saw as an obstacle into his shield. They reached the ravine where they had left the horses, just as the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. They mounted up and rode hard, not back towards Will's ranch, but deeper into the rugged, broken country of the mesas. We can't go back to the ranch, Will said, his voice grim. Croft will know we have the ledger. He won't stop until he gets it back. He'll burn the place to the ground if he has to. His words were prophetic. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they crested a high ridge and looked back across the valley towards Will's property. A thick plume of black smoke was rising into the clear morning air. It was his home, his ranch. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was being consumed by flames. Josephine watched in horror, her heart aching for him. He had lost his home because of her, because he had chosen to protect her. Will sat on his horse, watching the smoke for a long, silent moment. His face was a stoic mask, but Josephine could see the muscle working in his jaw, the immense effort it took to contain his rage and his grief. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were full of a terrible cold fire. "He left me nothing," Will said, his voice quiet but resonating with a dangerous intensity. "So now I have nothing to lose." The fire had not broken him. It had forged him into something harder, sharper. The cautious rancher was gone. In his place was an avenger. "He thinks he's won," Will continued. "He thinks we're running, that we'll try to get to the marshal in Prescott. That's what Tom was going to do, and it got him killed. We're not going to make the same mistake." "What are we going to do?" Josephine asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning fierce loyalty. She would follow this man anywhere. "We're not going to run from him," Will said, a new daring plan taking shape in his mind. "We're going to him. We're going to bring the fight to his doorstep." "To his ranch?" she asked, incredulous. "We can't. He has dozens of men." "Not to his ranch," Will said, a grim smile touching his lips. "To the town. To redemption. We're going to expose him in front of everyone. We're going to use his own arrogance against him." It was a bold, almost suicidal plan. To walk back into the town that had rejected her, the town run by a corrupt sheriff in the pocket of the man who wanted them dead. But it was also brilliant. Croft's power was built on a carefully constructed facade of legitimacy and respectability. To shatter that facade in public would be to destroy him more completely than any bullet could. "He'll have the town locked down," Josephine pointed out, her practical mind racing. "The sheriff will arrest us on sight." "Not if we have an ally on the inside," Will said. He was thinking of a young deputy she had seen, a man named Miller, who always looked uncomfortable and ashamed in Sheriff Thorne's presence. "And not if we choose the right time and the right place." They spent the day hidden in a small, concealed canyon, resting the horses and themselves. Will tended to his wound, and Josephine tore strips from her petticoat to make a clean bandage for him. As she worked her fingers, gently cleaning the gash on his forehead, their eyes met. In that moment, in the quiet intimacy of the canyon, something shifted between them. The barriers of race, of circumstance, of their strange and violent meeting fell away. They were no longer just a protector and his charge. They were partners bound together by shared danger and a common purpose. A flicker of a deeper, more profound connection passed between them. A promise of something that might one day grow in the ashes of their old lives. As dusk began to fall, they set their plan in motion. They would ride to redemption under the cover of darkness. They would not be sneaking in as fugitives. They would be walking in as accusers. They had the truth in their saddlebag, and they were going to use it to set a fire of their own. A fire of righteous justice that would either consume Harrison Croft or themselves. The final confrontation was at hand. The town of Redemption was a fortress under the blanket of darkness, with Croft's armed men lurking in the shadows. Will and Josephine moved through the back alleys to the small house of Deputy Miller. "Foreman," the pale deputy whispered at his window, "Croft will kill you." "Only if you let him," Will said urgently, holding up the ledger. "We have the proof. He murdered Tom Jones. You have to choose a side, the law or a murderer." Josephine's voice was steady. "My fiancé trusted the law. Don't let him die for nothing." A flicker of resolve hardened Miller's face. "What do you need me to do?" The plan was simple, relying on Croft's arrogance. The next day was Sunday, and Croft, playing the part of a pious community pillar, would be at church, a public place, surrounded by the townspeople he terrorized. The next morning, as the church bell tolled, Josephine slipped into a back pew. Will hid in the choir loft, ledger in hand. Harrison Croft entered like a king, taking his seat in the front pew with Sheriff Thorne 2 rows behind him. As the nervous preacher began his sermon, a clear voice rang out from the loft. "Before you speak of redemption," Will called, "let's speak of murder." A collective gasp went through the congregation. Croft stood, his face a mask of fury, his hand going for his gun. "Foreman, you're under arrest," Sheriff Thorne bellowed. "On whose orders?" Will's voice boomed. "The law's or the man who pays your salary?" He held up the ledger. "I have Jones's proof." "A ledger of every head of cattle you've stolen, Croft. Every bribe you've paid to Thorne." At that moment, Deputy Miller drew his gun on his boss. "It's over, Sheriff." Thorne hesitated. Will tossed the ledger down, and it landed at the feet of the storekeeper. "Read it," Josephine cried. "He murdered Mr. Jones to keep that book secret." The storekeeper opened the ledger, his face paling. "It's true," he whispered in horror. "My herd from last spring. He stole them all." The spell of fear shattered, replaced by a roar of betrayal. Seeing his empire crumble, Croft snarled and fired at the easiest target, Josephine. Will had already dropped from the loft, shoving Josephine to the floor as the bullet splintered the pew behind them. The church erupted into chaos. Will fired back as Croft dove for cover behind the altar. At the back of the church, Thorne and Miller exchanged shots. It was a desperate, brutal gunfight in the house of God. Will advanced through the pews, ignoring a bullet that tore through his arm. He kicked over the altar, exposing Croft as he fumbled to reload. Will fired. Croft collapsed, his reign of terror over. In the ensuing silence, Sheriff Thorne lay wounded, his betrayal exposed. Deputy Miller stood over him, his face grim. It was over. Days later, with the arrival of the territorial marshals, the full story came out. Thorne and Croft's men were arrested, and the shadow over redemption was lifted. Will's ranch was a ruin, and Josephine's intended life a ghost. But as they stood in the dust of the town, they had freed, they were not broken. They had lost everything, but they had found each other. Will, his arm in a sling, looked at Josephine, his eyes holding a new light. His land is gone. Mine is gone. But the territory is wood. We can start again. Together. Josephine looked at the half-Apache warrior who had risked everything for justice. She had come west for a life she'd lost before it began, but had found something more profound. She had found a partner. "Yes," she said, a true smile of hope reaching her eyes. "Together." She took his hand. Their future was an unwritten page, but they would face it together, 2 survivors who had found their redemption, not in a place, but in each other. The story of Josephine and Will doesn't end here. It's just the beginning of a new chapter, one they'll write together. If their journey from strangers to saviors fighting for justice in a lawless land captured your heart, please let us know. Hit that like button to show your support and share this story with others who love a classic Western tale of courage and redemption. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories from the untamed West waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for riding along with us. We'll see you on the next trail.